Montana Territory, 1883, the morning freight wagon rolled into the town of Elkhorn with dust on its wheels and a woman in its back, wrapped in a gray shawl and silence. Juliet Norrin had been returned. She stepped down onto the dirt street like someone walking back into a nightmare. Her boots met the ground with a soft thud, and she did not look up. The man who had ordered her, Samuel Briggs, a story owner with a gut full of sour ale and hands like hammers, stood across the street with his arms folded, watching. He had sent for a wife through the agency in St. Louis. Juliet had arrived 3 weeks ago. He did not like the sound of her voice, said she talked too slow, said she cried in her sleep, said she was not what he paid for, so he sent her back. But the freight driver brought her right back again, said the agency would not take her. Said she was his problem now. Samuel spit in the dirt and turned away. Juliet stood alone in the street, holding the shawl tighter around her. Her hair was pinned up, but she looked worn down, cheeks hollowed by the long trip, eyes dark from being unwanted. From the edge of the livery stable, a tall man watched. His name was Vernon Vale. He was not from Elkhorn but had been working cattle up near Helena and drifted down for supplies. He had seen the whole scene, Samuel's anger, the way Juliet flinched when he raised his voice, the way no one else stepped forward. Vernon stepped off the porch, boots steady, hat low over his brow. He spoke in a calm voice, not loud, not soft. "Ma'am," he said, "do you need help?" Juliet looked up, eyes wary. "I am not anyone's problem," she said. "I did not say you were," Vernon replied. She looked unsure, swaying on her feet. "I will find work," she said. "Somewhere," he nodded once. "There is an empty bunkhouse out by my land. I am not offering anything more than that, but you will be safe and warm and no man will lay a hand on you." Her voice cracked. "Why?" "Because I would want someone to do the same if it were my sister," he said. Juliet's hands trembled. She looked over her shoulder. Samuel was gone. No one else had spoken to her. "All right," she said. That was how it began. The ride out to Vernon's land was quiet. He kept the wagon slow, let her rest. She watched the trees pass, green and gold under the autumn sun. His ranch was nestled between 2 ridgelines, a good stretch of grass, a red barn, a small house with smoke curling from the chimney. The bunkhouse sat 50 feet off, clean but plain. He helped her down, showed her the stove, the cot, the pitcher of water. "I will bring supper later," he said. "If you want it," Juliet nodded. "Thank you." He tipped his hat and left. That night she sat by the window and watched the stars rise. She did not cry. She just sat there, hands folded in her lap, like she was waiting for something to make sense again. The next morning Vernon found her milking his lone cow. "You do not have to do that," he said. "I do not like to." "Oh," she answered. He nodded. "All right." They worked side by side after that. She helped in the kitchen, cleaned the tack room. She never complained, never asked for anything. But Vernon noticed how she stood with her shoulders tight, like she was always ready to run. He did not ask about Samuel. He did not ask what happened before. But he started bringing her coffee in the mornings, and she started setting aside a plate for him at supper. Days passed. Leaves fell. Snow dusted the high peaks. Then one evening she came to the barn with a lantern in her hand. He was brushing down his bay mare. She leaned against the post, watching. "I thought I would never be wanted," she said. "Not really." "You were wrong," Vernon said. She blinked. "Why are you kind to me?" He set the brush down. "Because you are worth it." Her breath shook. Then she lowered her eyes. "I was not what he expected, Samuel. He wanted someone loud and pretty. I am neither." Vernon stepped closer. He did not touch her. "You are quiet and you are steady. And you are beautiful, Juliet." Her eyes filled, but she did not let the tears fall. She whispered, "No one has said that to me in a long time." Vernon's voice was low. "Then let me be the first of many." They stood there in the soft light, the only sound the horse shifting in its stall. Then she said something that broke his heart. "I was returned like a parcel." Vernon's jaw tightened. "You were not a parcel, you were a woman, and if you will let me, I would like to make sure you are never treated like that again." She looked up at him. "Why?" He finally stepped forward, close enough to feel her breath. "Because you are mine," he said, "if you will have me." Juliet stared at him, her face trembling. You mean that, he touched her cheek, gentle as a whisper. I have never meant anything more. And then she folded into him, her hands gripping the fabric of his shirt, and he wrapped his arms around her like he had been waiting his whole life to do it. She was not returned anymore. She was home. The first heavy snow came 5 days after Juliet leaned into Vernon's chest and let herself be held. It fell through the night and into morning, cloaking the valley in white hush. Wind leaned low against the doorframes, but the bunkhouse stayed warm. The stove crackling steady from the logs Vernon had split the day before. Juliet stood at the window with her hands wrapped around a tin mug. She didn't drink from it. She only held it, feeling the heat soak into her fingers. Across the yard, Vernon moved through the snow in his sheepskin coat, leading the mare from the barn to the lean-to. He didn't look toward the window, but she could tell he knew she was watching. When he came back inside, he stamped his boots at the threshold and set down a burlap sack of oats near the stove. His beard had caught snowflakes that hadn't melted yet. I'll need to ride into town tomorrow, he said, pulling off his gloves. Supplies are low, and the post's been held back near the pass. Might be the last break before real winter sets in. Juliet set the mug down. Will you be gone long, back by dusk if the weather holds? She hesitated, then asked, Would you mind if I came? Vernon looked at her, not startled, just quiet. You sure? I've been waiting to feel like myself again, she said. I think part of that's remembering I can go where I choose. He nodded once. All right. They left early the next day, bundled against the cold, the wagon creaking beneath them. The road into Elkhorn was slow going, the wheels catching in drifts, but they didn't speak much. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't distance anymore, it was comfort. She didn't flinch when their shoulders brushed. He didn't apologize when he handed her the reins and let her steer for a while. The town hadn't changed. Samuel's storefront stood shuttered, a cracked pane in the upper window. No one turned their heads when Juliet stepped down from the wagon, but a few women paused longer than they used to. One of them, gray-haired, wrapped in a wool scarf, offered a nod as Juliet passed. Inside the general store, Vernon picked over sacks of flour and lamp oil while Juliet lingered near the shelf of sewing needles. Her fingers ran over the paper sleeves, not quite touching. When she turned, the storekeeper's wife, a round-faced woman with a crooked wrist, smiled faintly. You're the one from the freight wagon, she said, not unkindly. Juliet met her gaze. I am, the woman nodded. We heard what he did, it wasn't right, but some of us, we know that doesn't mean you're to be pitied. I don't want pity, Juliet said. I want a life. Well, the woman replied, you look like you're building one. Outside, they loaded the wagon beneath a sky that was starting to bruise purple along the edges. Vernon passed her a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. She frowned at it. What's this? Needles. You looked like you wanted them. She hadn't said a word about it. You notice everything, don't you? She asked. Only the parts that matter. They rode home with the wind at their backs and the scent of pine sharp in the air. The bunkhouse glowed golden by the time they reached the ridge, smoke curling up again into the dark. That night, she brought over a patch of cloth and set it on the table where he was carving a new handle for his brush. The fire snapped low behind them. I thought I might try stitching again, she said. I used to be decent with it. My father taught me. Vernon didn't look up from his work. Tell me about him. Juliet hesitated. He worked leather in Illinois, had a limp from falling off a roof in his 20s. He said every scar had to earn its keep. Vernon nodded slowly. That's a good way to think on it. She watched his hands move slow, sure, never wasting effort. I'd like to earn mine, she said, not hide them. He set the handle down and looked at her. You already are. Juliet studied his face, the lines near his eyes, the way his voice never rushed. You don't act like a man waiting for something. I'm not, he said. I'm living it. She folded the cloth in her lap, fingers smoothing the edges. Then I'd like to learn how. Vernon reached across the table and took her hand, letting it rest in his without pressure, just enough to be real. You already are, he said again, quiet and steady. And in the hush between them, with the snow pressed thick outside and the stove flickering low, Juliet felt something shift, not sudden, not sharp. Just the slow, sure opening of a door long closed. She didn't cry, she only held his hand and did not let go. The days shortened without ceremony. Light slipped away early, replaced by the soft blue dusk that settled against the windows like breath on glass. Vernon began rising before dawn to check the fences, and Juliet had taken to baking in the mornings, her hands dusted with flour by first light. They moved around each other easily now without need for direction. One morning, she carried a loaf of rye bread to the house and paused in the doorway, watching Vernon lean over the table, reading a folded slip of paper in the dim glow. "Something wrong?" she asked, setting the bread down. He brushed his thumb along the edge of the note. "My neighbor passed," he said, "Jonah's ward. Hart gave out sometime last week. His boy rode in from Deer Lodge to handle the land." Juliet leaned her hip against the counter. "Did you know him well?" "Not close," Vernon said, folding the paper. "But he lent me seed 2 springs back when my barley didn't take, never asked for it back." She nodded slowly, then picked up the knife and began slicing the bread. "Will you go?" "I ought to. There's a gathering this Sunday, just neighbors, quiet." She handed him a piece, still warm. "I'll come." Vernon looked at her, surprised, but didn't question it. "All right." The Ward homestead sat farther north, tucked beneath a line of wind-worn pines. When they arrived, the yard was dotted with wagons and bundled figures. No music, no pastor. Just men and women standing in the cold, hands clasped, eyes downcast. Juliet kept close to Vernon, her gloved hand brushing his coat sleeve now and then. A young man, not much older than 20, stood near the barn doors. His face was drawn, eyes rimmed red. Vernon approached with a quiet nod. "You must be Ali," he said. "Yes, sir." "I'm Vernon Vale. This is Juliet." Ali nodded to her, polite but distracted. "He spoke of you," he said to Vernon, "said you kept your word." "I tried to." Ali looked past them for a long moment. He didn't speak much near the end. "Just sat out back watching the ridgeline. I think he knew." Juliet stepped forward. "He had a peaceful place here." Ali's throat worked. "He built it with his hands, every post, every nail." Vernon clapped a hand to the young man's shoulder just once. "If you need help setting the winter stores, say so." Ali nodded again, grateful. They didn't linger long. As they turned to leave, Juliet paused near the porch steps, eyes drifting to a broken horseshoe nailed above the threshold. "I used to think grief felt like drowning," she said quietly once they were back in the wagon, "but it's more like being hollowed out, carved quiet." Vernon kept his eyes on the road. "It leaves room," he said, "for something new if you let it." The wagon creaked on through the snow. She didn't reply, but her hand found his on the bench seat and stayed there. Later that week, Juliet pulled a bundle of dried herbs from the root cellar and laid them across the table. Vernon was rubbing oil into his saddle near the hearth. "I'd like to make a salve," she said. "I remember how. My mother used to blend lard and pine resin for burns." He glanced over. "We've got both. I thought maybe it could help with your hands, the cold's cracking them deep." He flexed his fingers, surprised. "I hadn't noticed." "I had." She mixed the salve that night, slow and careful, humming under her breath. When she brought it to him, he held out his hands without hesitation. She smeared the ointment gently, her thumbs moving over the ridges of his knuckles. "You've worked hard for a long time," she murmured. "So have you." She looked up. "Not always at the right things. You're here now." That night they sat by the fire long after the flames had dipped low. She rested her head against his shoulder and he pulled the wool blanket higher around her. "You said something once," she whispered, "that you'd want someone to help if it were your sister." "I remember, but I'm not your sister." He turned his head slowly, his breath warm against her temple. "No, you're not." Juliet lifted her face to meet his eyes. "You called me yours." "I did, and you meant it. I still do." She reached up and touched his cheek, the pads of her fingers soft against the roughness there. "Then I'm not waiting anymore." She kissed him first, quiet and certain and without hesitation. His hands settled around her waist, steady as snowfall, and when they pulled apart, she said, "I'm not hollow anymore." Vernon smiled just enough to reach his eyes. "No," he said. "You're full of light." In the days that followed, the world outside turned hard with frost. Trees rimed silver, and the creek behind the barn froze in slow, silent layers. The rhythms of the ranch grew quieter, more inward. Smoke curled from chimneys longer into the morning, and boots were left by doors to dry out overnight. Juliet had begun sewing again in earnest, repairing old shirts, hemming saddle blankets, even piecing together a quilt from scraps found in a trunk Vernon had nearly forgotten in the corner of the loft. She worked in the main house now, more often than not, the bunkhouse door left shut behind her. One evening, as Vernon scrubbed down his tack near the hearth, she laid out the nearly finished quilt across the bed and studied it in the lamplight. "You made all that by hand?" he asked without looking up. She brushed her knuckles along a square of blue calico. "Every stitch." "Took more patience than I remembered I had. You always had it." She turned, folding her arms. "You speak like you've known me forever." "I don't need forever to know what's true." She didn't answer right away, then she stepped closer, her voice quieter. "I never had a bed of my own that stayed in one place." Vernon set the bridle down. "You do now." She let that settle between them, then nodded once, slow. That night she stayed past the hour she usually left. When Vernon stepped outside to check the coals in the smokehouse, he returned to find her asleep on the bench beside the stove, arms folded, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. He didn't wake her, just draped his coat over her and sat nearby, letting the firelight dance across the room. By morning her hands were folded neatly in her lap, the coat still tucked around her. She looked over at him, her voice hoarse from sleep. "I didn't mean to stay." "I didn't mind." She stood slowly, brushing wrinkles from her skirt. "I'd like to start keeping hens. There's space behind the shed, and I've been saving egg money from mending." Vernon looked up from where he was lacing his boots. "Then we'll build a coop." Her brow furrowed. "You don't have to, I want to. You're building a life here, Juliet." "I'd be a fool not to help shape it." She nodded once. "Then we'll need cedar planks. I'll ask Mrs. Liddell in town. Her boy runs the mill." They rode into town the next day, bundled in wool and oilcloth against the wind. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and pine pitch, and the streets were quieter than usual. When they reached the mill house, Juliet stepped down first, pulling her shawl tighter. Mrs. Liddell met them on the porch, her apron dusted with flour. "He's out back," she said, jerking her chin toward the sawline. "You'll want Reuben." Juliet turned to Vernon. "I can handle this." He nodded, stepping back. "I'll check the smithy, see if the bridle's ready." She found Reuben near the pile of offcuts, sleeves rolled and face smudged with ash. He looked up as she approached. "I heard about you," he said before she could speak. "You were the one sent off and brought back again." She met his eyes. "That's not who I am anymore." He scratched at his jaw. "Didn't say it was, just meant folks talk. I'd like to buy cedar planks." "Enough for a henhouse, I have coin." He tilted his head. "You building it yourself, with help." He nodded, impressed. "I'll have the boards cut by Friday. Ain't many women I see out here asking after lumber." "I'm not many women." She left him standing there, stunned and silent. Vernon met her down the street, holding a wrapped parcel. "They fixed the buckle. I ordered the wood. We'll need to pick it up before snow hits again." He raised his brow. "You don't waste time, do you?" "Not anymore." On the ride home, he reached over and took her hand, letting his thumb trace the inside of her wrist. "You're not just living here now," he said. "You're taking root." She looked at him, eyes steady. "I want to be someone who stays." "You already are." That night, as the wind picked up and the sky turned to slate, Juliet stood barefoot beside the hearth, watching the flames twist. "I used to think I didn't belong anywhere," she said. "That I was always going to be passed along like something borrowed." Vernon stood behind her, arms loose at his sides. "You're not borrowed, Juliet." She turned. "I know that now." He stepped forward, slow and sure, and cupped her face in both hands. "I want to build everything with you," he said. "Whatever comes." I want that too. They kissed with quiet certainty, not rushed or breathless, just a long, steady promise. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft as ash, erasing the old tracks and making way for new. They built the henhouse in 3 days. The cedar planks arrived bundled and damp from snowmelt, and Vernon laid them out beneath the eaves to dry while Juliet measured the posts with a length of twine. She drove every nail herself, her gloves worn at the fingers by the time the last board was set. Vernon only stepped in where the weight required it. The rest he left to her hands. By the end of the 3rd day, the coop stood straight and square behind the shed, door latched with a bit of bent iron Vernon had shaped at the forge. Juliet leaned on the fence rail, brushing straw from her skirt, and stared at the finished work. "It's solid," she said. Vernon nodded. "It'll hold through winter." She turned toward him. "I never thought I'd be proud of something like this. You made it yours." "I did." They picked up 3 hens from a ranch widow half a day east. The woman, Mrs. Harker, had rheumatism in her hips and was glad to be rid of them before the freeze deepened. Juliet rode alongside Vernon the whole way back, the hens settled in a crate between them, clucking faintly beneath the wool blanket. That night, they shared supper at the table without rush or need for talk. The oil lamp hissed faintly above them, and the fire burned low. After the plates were cleared, Vernon unwrapped a small bundle from his coat pocket and slid it across the table. Juliet unfolded the cloth to find a carved wooden brooch inside an elk, notched and shaped with care, its antlers delicate but true. She looked up slowly. "You made this. I started it weeks ago. Thought maybe you'd want something to pin at your collar come spring." She ran her thumb along the grain. "I will." Then she rose, rounded the table, and pressed her lips to his cheek. "You make this place feel like it can stretch around me." "It already has," he said. The brooch stayed at her bedside every night after that, wrapped in linen until the snows softened. By February, the hens were laying. Small brown shells, warm when lifted from the straw. Juliet gathered them each morning before the sun rose, humming low as she moved through the yard in her heavy coat. Vernon watched her from the porch while drinking his coffee, the steam rising between his fingers. One morning, she didn't return to the house right away. He found her standing near the back gate, holding something in her hands. A single egg cracked at one end, the membrane torn. She didn't speak until he was beside her. "It froze before I could get to it." "One loss out of many," Vernon said. She turned the shell in her palm. "There was a time when I'd have taken that as a sign. And now, I just think I'll get up earlier tomorrow." By March, the snow retreated into the gullies and the trees near the ridge began to green at the tips. The creek broke open again, running shallow but sure. Juliet planted onions and cabbage behind the bunkhouse, her dress hitched at the waist, fingers buried in the thawed dirt. Vernon came home one afternoon with a pair of young apple saplings tied behind the saddle. "You plan to stay long enough to eat the fruit?" she asked, brushing soil from her hands. He tied the reins. "I plan to stay as long as you do." They planted the trees at dusk. She dug the holes while he steadied the trunks. When she pressed the earth firm around the roots, he reached for her hand and didn't let go. "I've been thinking," he said. She looked at him without flinching. "About what? What's next?" Her voice stayed quiet. "You already gave me more than I expected. I want to give you everything else, too." She didn't speak, but her fingers tightened around his. "I'd like you to marry me, Juliet." She stood still for a breath, the wind tugging faintly at her hair, then she smiled. Yes. They were married beneath the cottonwoods at the edge of the pasture 2 weeks later. No preacher, just a neighbor with a clear voice and a Bible worn through at the spine. Mrs. Liddell brought pickled carrots and a loaf of sour bread. Reuben from the mill gave them a carved spoon and said nothing else. Ellie Ward came down from his father's land to stand witness. Juliet wore a dress she'd sewn from muslin and lace pulled from an old curtain. Vernon combed his hair with water from the creek and shaved with a steel blade that had belonged to his father. They exchanged vows with hands clasped and heads bowed. When it was done, Vernon kissed her once, gentle and certain, and she kissed him back with no hint of fear. That night, long after the guests had gone and the sky had turned violet with stars, they sat on the porch together, her hand resting in his lap, his thumb tracing the back of it. "You've settled me," she said. "You've steadied me," he answered. They stayed that way until the fire inside burned low, and then they rose together and went in. The garden grew well that summer, fed by creek water and her careful tending. The hens multiplied, and Vernon built a second coop behind the first. She taught 2 neighbor girls to sew, and he taught a boy from town how to mend fence post wire. They saved enough to buy a milk cow from a ranch 2 valleys west. Each night they ate side by side, and each morning they rose with the light. There was no grand fortune, no miracle. Just the steady, deliberate work of a home built together, word by word, nail by nail, day by day. When the first frost came again, Juliet wrapped herself in the same gray shawl she had arrived in. But her shoulders no longer curled inward. Her gaze was not downcast. She walked the yard with a bridled mare behind her, calling softly to the dog that had taken to sleeping beneath the porch. Inside, Vernon was carving again this time, a cradle. And when she stepped through the door, brushing snow from her coat, he looked up and smiled the way he always did when she came home. She crossed to him, cupped his face in both hands, and said, "We're going to need more room." He stood without a word and pulled her close. Outside, the wind rose through the pines, but the house stayed warm. And so did they for all the years that followed.